Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Next Week with Jeff Durbin. I am Jeff Durbin, and I am also very excited about this particular episode we're about to do right now because I have actually one of my favorite people on, and I think you're going to really enjoy him. He is Dr. Jason Lisle. He is a Christian. He is big on the foundation and grounding of the scientific method. He is big on the universe and what we can learn and just stuff on fractals. Yes, fractals in the Christian worldview will blow your mind. Go YouTube that after you watch this right here. And he is actually very, very concerned with his ministry and what he's devoted his life to actually demonstrate the creation account in the book of Genesis is not antagonistic towards science or the scientific method, what we know about science today. And so let's talk to Dr. Jason Lisle. Welcome, brother.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So let's get to it. Dr. Lisle, first of all, where can people go to get the bulk of your work? Where do you want to point people to for this episode?
The ministry is Biblical Science Institute, and our website, biblicalscienceinstitute.com. You can get all the information there. There's a bookstore there as well if you want to get some of the resources.
Okay, just quickly so we can get it started with this, what's one book you want people to get to understand really your position and where we need to sort of launch from?
I wrote a book a number of years ago called The Ultimate Proof of Creation. And it's a different kind of a book, but it's one that I would encourage everyone to read. It's kind of my personal favorite of everything I've done.
Okay, excellent. And I have that, and I've read it myself, so it's excellent. Dr. Lisle, so let's talk for a minute about science, the scientific method. We live in a time today where we have forgotten our roots. Our educational system teaches people really humanism and teaches people that their ancestors were highly evolved societies of bacteria. It teaches people that we evolved in a universe that doesn't care about us, really through different stages to get to where we are today. If we listen to people like Richard Dawkins, we'll hear that we're African apes. If we listen to Dr. Will Provine, the late atheist, he says there's no goal-directed forces in the universe. There is no ultimate meaning, no ultimate purpose. That's the worldview fed to our children, to our youth today. And we don't know from where we've come. We don't know that science actually came about as a result of the Christian worldview. We don't know the history of science and really how we got to where we're at today in terms of the demand for rational thinking, the demand for the scientific method, for empiricism, those sorts of things really only come from a biblical perspective of reality. And so, Dr. Lisle, can you help us with that? Christianity and science, are they opposed to one another? How do we view this?
There was the secular humanists a couple centuries ago started promoting this idea, the conflict thesis, that science is somehow antagonistic to the Christian faith. But that really is a relatively new idea, because the fact is that most of the founding fathers of science, not all of them, but most of them were Christians. And in fact, most of them were biblical creationists. They understood that God had created, that God upholds his universe in a consistent fashion. And that Christian conviction not only motivated their desire to understand the universe. It's not just an accident. You're not just studying, like spilled milk. You're studying something that has been designed,
right?
And as such, it has beauty in it. It has complexity in it. And so, most of the scientists of the past had that view, and science blossomed with the promulgation of Christianity in Europe and the early United States and so on. And a lot of people have forgotten that history, but the fact is we owe our scientific development to the Christian worldview, not just historically, but epistemologically as well.
That's right.
In order for science to make sense, in order for us to have confidence in the scientific method, we would have to have some good reasons for believing that it's a good procedure by which we can test certain truth claims. And that belief, I would argue, it only makes sense in the Christian worldview, where God upholds the universe in a consistent fashion. The universe is not chance, it's upheld by the mind of God, and as such, there is rationality behind the universe.
Yeah.
Human minds, we've been made in God's image, and so we have the capacity to think rationally. We don't always use that capacity, but we have that capacity.
Right.
And as such, we can think about the things that we observe in the universe. God has made our senses. He made the seeing eye, the hearing ear. The Lord God made them both, the Bible says. And as such, they reliably tell us about the universe. Maybe not perfectly. We are fallen creatures and so on. But nonetheless, our senses are designed. They're not just an accident of evolution. And as such, I can have some degree of confidence that what I see and hear and so on corresponds to the actual universe. And then I can use the mind that God gave me to process that information, and I can determine, I can discover truth. And that's something that the Christian worldview makes sense of. In an evolutionary universe, none of those things make sense. In an evolutionary universe, we're just an accident. So we're guided by natural selection, but that doesn't really improve the odds of getting a combination that works. It just is referring to the elimination of all those that didn't. So the fact is, if we're just the result of evolution, there's no reason to trust even in our own thinking. And
Right.
evolutionists don't like to hear that. Oh, of course we can trust our thinking. Yes, we can, to some extent, because we're made in the image of God.
That's right.
And so our minds have the capacity for rational thought. We can consider the various options and choose the best. That's rationality.
That's right.
If our minds are just chemistry, chemistry has no choice. It's not something that can consider and choose the best option. That doesn't make sense if we're just chemistry. The fact that the universe is sort of consistent, there are patterns to be discovered, that makes no sense if it's just an accident of a Big Bang. It just kind of popped into existence billions of years ago for no reason, not upheld by any mind. It makes no sense to try and uncover patterns in nature if there are no patterns to be discovered. And so really all of science is about trying to understand the consistent and predictable way that God normally upholds his creation today.
Yeah.
And that is justified in the Christian worldview. It is not justified in any other worldview.
That's right, exactly. And it's interesting, too, because you'll have people today, pop culture icons. You'll have people like Richard Dawkins, who actually is getting a new boost after being on Joe Rogan recently. You have people like Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett of the past, and Christopher Hitchens, of course, the late Christopher Hitchens, pop culture icons in terms of the humanist way of thinking that will actually try to pretend like it's the humanistic or atheistic worldview or perspective that actually owns science, dependence upon sense perception, laws of logic, observation and testing. But it's actually their worldview that militates against the use of any of those things. I mean, how can we trust our senses if we're just protoplasm in a universe that doesn't care about us? If we're just cosmic accidents, if there's no purpose, if there's no meaning, if there's no ultimate order to be trusted, if we can't trust the principle of induction, then how can we trust our senses? And what is a law of logic? And what is that in a materialist worldview? If all that exists is matter, what are we doing appealing to immaterial, unchanging universal laws? Where did we ever get that idea from? And even the scientific method itself is dependent upon observation and testing. And you just can't make sense of that perspective from the atheistic perspective. So what we often say, Dr. Lisle, together often, is that the atheists are actually borrowing capital from the Christian worldview in order to pay for all they're doing. They're borrowing capital from the Christian worldview to actually do the things they're doing. We would argue that the problem ultimately isn't a lack of evidence or light about God and Him as creator and His world. The problem is ultimately sin, as all of us are sinners, and we hold down the truth. We don't want the real God, and so we exchange Him for something else. So I think that's very, very clear. By the way, your book is excellent on explaining all of that, and you have so many great talks on this discussion. But let's get to some interesting things. Stuff that comes up. This is why I thought it'd be interesting to have you on to talk about this. Stuff comes up in terms of like, well, look, if the universe is expanding, we know that it's expanding. Well, then, if you say the Earth is only, this many thousand years old, I'm saying that it's billions of years old. And how does light stretch all the way across the universe? And it's only, 6,000 or 7,000 or however many thousand years old. In your model, you're saying that it's this young universe, but I'm saying it's billions of years old, and light traveling across the universe takes time. So you've got a problem, Dr. Lisle, in just the light issue. What do you say to that?
Well, there's a couple different ways I could answer that. One that before the show you'd alluded to is the fact that in the secular paradigm, the Big Bang, they have a light travel time problem. It's called the horizon problem. And in their view, they have to get light from one place to another place in the universe in less time than is possible given the speed of light, even in their view. And so I find that very ironic. You can't really criticize my view for having a light travel time issue, at least perceived one,
Yeah.
if your own model has exactly the same type of issue. It's the same in principle. So that's kind
Right.
of ironic. And so I wrote an article on that years ago.
Yeah.
And I still think that's a good answer. But that's sort of a disarming answer. That's just saying, you have the same issue, so you can't use that as a point against creation in favor of the Big Bang or anything like that.
Right.
But then some people say, okay, but what's the answer then? I think we have one. It's a little bit difficult to give in kind of a soundbite format like this,
Sure.
because it involves the nature of physics, the nature of space and time, and that's not something that most people understand. And so one of the things I wanted to do, I actually wrote a book about this a year or two ago, to bring people up to speed in terms of the basic physics that they need to know in order to understand that there is no starlight problem from a creationist point of view. There is no starlight problem. And the reason for that is people have created the starlight problem in their minds by assuming that the Bible is using a modern, what's called a synchrony convention. A synchrony convention is a technique by which we have two clocks read the same time at the same time when they're separated by a distance. When two clocks are right next to each other, it's easy to see if they're reading the same time. You can compare them directly. But if one clock is separated from another, how do you know if they're reading exactly the same time? Because it might take maybe it takes the light a little bit of time to get from one clock to the other, and so on. And so there's an entire field of physics that is investigating what we call synchrony conventions. And I maintain that the Bible is using an older synchrony convention, sometimes called the visual synchrony convention. I call it the anisotropic synchrony convention. And if you use that method of synchronizing clocks, then light, when it comes from those distant galaxies, it takes no time at all for it to reach the Earth. In fact, any observer sees incoming light as instantaneous. Not that there's anything magical about light. It has to do with the way space and time work, and the way we define what now means when it's at a distance. And Einstein was well aware of this. He wrote about it in his book on relativity. Sarkar and Stachel have written about this in technical secular literature. And one of them, I think Sarkar, is very adamantly anti-creationist. He just realized that there isn't a starlight problem in terms of getting the light to Earth instantaneously, even today. Doesn't mean the other convention is wrong. It's not the one the Bible's using, kind of like cubits versus feet. You can use feet to measure things. The Bible uses cubits. That's the more ancient convention.
Right.
It doesn't mean that one's right and the other's wrong. They're just different. And you have, if you're gonna, you can convert from one to another, but you have to do it right.
That's right.
So that's kind of the short answer. I don't want to get into
no. It's a powerful answer.
We have an answer to the distant starlight problem.
Absolutely.
I have written about it, and people can look that up if they're interested.
Absolutely. And I think the reason why I wanted you to do it, I know it's hard to do in sort of a soundbite like that, but at least it gets people sort of thinking. And maybe if God is working on a person in terms of opening their eyes and hearts to the truth, you can see that these aren't really problems for the Christian worldview. We do have powerful, scientifically grounded answers that are meaningful, that are not, just wishful thinking sort of things. Scientific, observational, solid answers. And a lot of times, I think some atheists I've run into aren't really concerned with the answers. I recently had a team debate with Dr. James White against some Utah atheists, a very actually intelligent man. And it was clear to me, Dr. Lisle, listening to him try to provide criticism of the Christian worldview, that he hasn't really read a book from a Christian who's dealt with these things. And that's typically my experience. I'm not saying across the board that's how all atheists are, but it was clear from talking to this particular atheist gentleman that he hadn't spent really any time trying to understand fundamentally what do we even believe about God. He didn't know what Christians really believe about the triune God, even though that's what we were debating that night. He hadn't actually studied it to understand it. The next thing is that he started bringing up objections to the creation account. And I think it'd be helpful for us to talk about that. So I'm going to sort of I'm going to give it to you. I think this is your area. So when you hear atheists criticizing the creation account, saying that's unscientific, it goes against what we know about the history of the world, this universe, all the rest. Well, get us going there. What do you say to that?
Well, I'm happy to, if there's any specific objection they have, I'm happy to try and answer that. A lot of times that people are saying, well, persuade me. Well, I can't persuade you. All I can do is show you that there's no logical objection to the creation account.
Right.
God is all powerful. He can do what he wants. He's told us specifically what he's done in the creation account there in Genesis chapter 1, with Genesis chapter 2 giving more details on the events of day 6. I don't see any contradiction there. Now, if someone brings up specific objections, then I'm happy to answer those.
I got one.
Uh,
I got
okay.
one. So
Yeah.
here's the one he was throwing out. He threw it about 2 or 3 times in the debate, and the problem was, in terms of our debate with the atheists that particular day, is that wasn't really the topic of our debate. In terms of, that wasn't what we were supposed to all be arguing about, in terms of the specifics of the creation account, those sorts of things. If that was a particular debate, I'd be happy to do that. But one of the things he was sort of just tossing out as one of the chestnuts is, I mean, come on, Christian, stupid. We've got plants and things growing, trees growing before light. That's what he was alleging. And so, how would you respond to something like that?
Well, if that's, I can't remember. I did watch that debate, by the way.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And my impression as well was that he didn't really know much about the Christian worldview. Certainly not much about creation.
Right.
I forget I don't want to misquote him. I don't remember exactly what he said. But if he's saying that we had plants before light, that's demonstrably false. The Bible says light's made on day 1, plants are made on day 3. Of course we had light.
Mm-hmm.
Now some people say, oh, but you have plants before you have the sun. That's true. The sun wasn't made until day 4. So those plants had to go 24 hours without sunlight, but not 24 hours without light. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Even if we didn't have light, plants can live for 24 hours without light.
Right.
Not that they needed to, but they certainly can live without sunlight. Some people grow plants indoors. As long as you have a light source, that's all you need for photosynthesis. There's nothing magical about sunlight. Any light source will do, providing it's within a certain frequency range. Any light source will allow for photosynthesis. And the fact that people sometimes grow plants indoors, providing there's sufficient light, demonstrates you don't need the sun, you just need light. Did we have light on day 3? Yes. Genesis 1, verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So God replaced that temporary light source with the sun on day 4, but it wouldn't have any effect on plants. They did have light, and in any case, they were only without the sun for 24 hours anyway.
Very good. I would toast to you with some coolant right now, but I left it at home. So.
The funny thing, too, if I could just add, because at the end of that debate, when he was saying, if you're a Christian, drink this coolant, you'll be okay. Well, of course, there was some textual criticism that needed to be done there anyway. But
right.
The fact is, in the Christian worldview, no. In the Christian worldview, I have a good reason to think that if I drink, something that's poisonous, I'm going to have serious problems. Because in the Christian worldview, God has promised to uphold the universe in a consistent way. Genesis 8:22, God promises the basic cycles of nature will be in the future as they have been in the past. And so in the past, if somebody drinks poison and they don't do so well, that's a good indication that in the future, if you drink poison, you're not going to do so well. But that is a Christian conception. Indeed, it's the atheist who should say, hey, it's a chance of the universe. Maybe the next time I drink poison, it'll be the best experience of my life.
It'll be delicious.
So it's kind of, he was really arguing against his own position without realizing it.
He really was. He really was. There's a million different ways. Yeah. So let's do this. Maybe this will be beneficial for everyone. We've already talked about, Dr. Lisle, how with the biblical worldview, we get science, we get observation, we get sense perception, we get laws of logic, we get ethical absolutes in terms of even having discussions. There's always the assumption that the person who's telling you about evidence or telling you about this thing or that, that they have to be honest in talking about it. So, for example, when scientists say, hey, we performed this test and this is what we came up with, everybody is coming with the assumption that there's an absolute standard of morality that you're required to be honest about your findings, right? Like when we find out that there are scientists who actually fudged the results or lied to get extra money or whatever, we actually condemn that. We say that was dishonest, that was wrong, you're not allowed to behave that way. Well, all of that you don't get with atheism. You don't get it with a humanist perspective of reality. But I think what's fascinating, and it always has fascinated me, it's actually one of the things I just love to study the most when I have free time. I love, Dr. Lisle, to learn about all the evidences of creation and a younger earth. So let's talk about that for a minute. What are some of the things that you think about, and these are just like wow moments for you in terms of creation and a younger earth?
Yeah, in terms of of course, the Bible's very clear about that in 6 days and so on. In terms of the science that confirms that, one of the things that's really compelling to me is carbon dating. A lot of people think that carbon dating gives the millions of years. It doesn't. Now, there are other techniques that secular scientists believe indicate, billions of years, like uranium lead dating and so on, but not carbon dating. Carbon dating, works a lot better than these other methods. All these methods are based on certain assumptions, but at least with carbon dating, when we test it on things of known age, it tends to give the right answer. So I have some degree of confidence in carbon dating. And whenever you carbon date anything, you get ages that are roughly consistent with the biblical time scale. Coal, you can take a chunk of coal. Now, coal beds are supposed to be I forget what the exact date, hundreds of millions of years old. In the secular view, that's when they formed. And you can take a chunk of coal and carbon date it, you'll get thousands of years, very consistently. It doesn't matter where you get the coal from, you'll get thousands of years. Wow. And in fact, that's so striking. And the reason it's striking is because, and maybe I should explain the method a little bit. The way carbon dating works, most carbon is C12. It's got 6 protons, 6 neutrons in the nucleus. There's a variety of carbon called C14, which has 2 extra neutrons, and that makes it unstable. C14 will spontaneously decay into nitrogen. It'll just change into nitrogen. And for any given atom, it's kind of random. You don't know when it's going to happen. But you get a large collection of atoms, and after 5,700 years, half of them will have converted into nitrogen. It's kind of like popcorn. You don't know when the next kernel is going to pop, but you do know that after 2 minutes, your popcorn is pretty well done.
Right.
And so it's the same way with carbon-14 atoms. You know that after a certain amount of time, half of them will have decayed away, and then half again after that, so on, such that if the entire Earth were nothing but C14 atoms, after 1 million years, you'd not have a single atom left. They would all have decayed because it vaporizes that quickly. It turns into nitrogen that quickly. And so, and I didn't believe it until I did the calculation myself. It's true.
Wow.
So anything that's 1 million years old should not have one atom of C14 in it. And yet we find it in everything that's got carbon in it. We find it in dinosaur remains. You carbon date dinosaur remains, you get thousands of years. We find it in diamonds that evolutionists believe to be 1 to 2 billion years old. They got C14 in it. C14 half-life's 5,700 years. So I just find that absolutely incompatible with an old Earth. It just doesn't make sense.
That's right. Powerful stuff. Wow. So give me another one. We have time. Let's do another one. What's another interesting fact about creation in terms of evidence and science and the creation account that we have now? What would you say?
The decay of Earth's magnetic field. Okay. It's got a half-life of something like 1,200, 1,400 years. And so the rate at which Earth's magnetic field is decaying is consistent with a time scale of about 6,000 years. That's a pretty tight constraint because it's an exponential decay as far as we can tell. And so you run it backwards. But, exponential decay, it gets shallower and shallower, but which means you run it backwards, it gets steeper and steeper. And you run it back 6,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field will be 20 times larger than it is today, 20 times stronger. And that's impressive. But if you run it back 60,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field would have been stronger than that of a neutron star, which is enough to rip the atoms of your body apart. So you don't want that. And it's not just the Earth's magnetic field.
Human
popcorn. A lot of the planets of the solar system, Jupiter has an incredibly powerful magnetic field. Magnetic fields do not last millions of years. They decay, and they have to. And the reason they have to is because they're caused by electrical current in the core. Electricity encounters resistance, batteries run down. And the rate at which they do is exponential. So all of this makes sense in light of the biblical time scale or human population growth. There's no way you can sustain human population growth for millions of years. The human race has been here for a few thousand years.
That's right.
A friend of mine, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, his PhD in biology from Harvard, he did studies on mutation rates of various organisms to say how long, assuming animals had no mutations in them originally, how long have these species been on Earth to where they would accumulate the current amount of mutations that they have? And inevitably, it's very close to 6,000 years. It's nowhere near millions of years.
That's right.
Just lots of stuff like that, really, that my secular colleagues, they kind of scratch their heads and say, boy, that's interesting. We don't know what's causing that. Well, it's consistent with creation. A lot of stuff like that.
And you're raising your hand. I know. All right, Dr. Lisle, you're a huge blessing to the church, brother. Keep going, man. You're just a gift to all of us. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. Dr. Jason Lisle, where can they go for the people who just jumped onto the broadcast? Where can they go to get more from you?
We're at the Biblical Science Institute, and our website is biblicalscienceinstitute.com. We have a lot of free articles on that website, and there's a bookstore as well. You can get books or DVDs on these topics. We'd encourage you to check those out.
All right, Dr. Jason Lisle, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. Next week with Jeff Durbin. Catch you guys when we come right back from the break. Thank you, guys.
At the Runner Academy, we arm and train emerging leaders to live out their calling in a way that truly honors Christ as the Lord of all things, especially in areas like medicine, law, politics, education, the church, business, and the arts.
The Runner Academy is hosted at the EICC Centre for Reformational Culture, an environment that provides a healthy balance of work and rest, and that stimulates creative discussion for engaging with and shaping culture to the glory of God. On this 24-acre farm and retreat centre, delegates can expect to find challenging teaching, but also fun and fellowship with like-minded Christians who are concerned to recover a vision of God's glory and who are committed to think through what it means to live the Christian life in all its fullness.
Apply today and get equipped to face the critical issues of our time with a deep, rich, and joyful confidence in the Lordship of Jesus Christ over all life and culture.
The goal for New St. Andrews College, as it trains its students, is not to make people who will be able to go out and just get jobs, people who will just be bricks in the wall of our society. The goal for New St. Andrews College is to make students into men and women who will really impact culture.
Go to apologiastudios.com, get signed up, partner with us on All Access. You get all of the radio programs, you get the TV show, you get the after show, including Apologia Academy, and you partner with us in ministry, bringing the gospel around the world. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Next Week with Jeff Durbin. That was wonderful. Dr. Jason Lisle. This is the Bear, Luke Pearson.
What up?
All right, that's right. Yes, yes.
Got more cheers this time.
All right, so hey, Dr. Lisle wants the debate. How cool is that?
That's what happens when you have someone that's friends with Dr. White.
That's right, that's right. Yes, Dr. White loves Jason Lisle.
And so does Pastor Zach.
That's right, yes.
Like a
very good.
lot.
Really encourage everybody, he does. I really encourage everybody to go, and I think probably the best place to go, just go look for it is search on YouTube, Jason Lisle Fractals. It's an amazing discussing. Amazing.
You almost made amazingness.
It's late. It's an amazing discussion. You'll really see how the Christian worldview provides a grounding for so many aspects of our reality. And so I highly encourage a look at that discussion from Dr. Jason Lisle. So, hey, let's talk. You got a card? So let's do a discussion about science.
Yeah.
Science.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mr. White. Science.
Yeah, science. All right. Okay. So.
This isn't about science.
Okay.
Unless you're talking about, like, the law of or science of law and justice.
We'll weave in and out.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So did you see the
El Camino? Yes.
Yes,
yeah,
I
great
did.
Ending.
That was also really good. There was only a small bit of Mr. White in there, though.
Very
Just
small.
very small.
Very small.
And no Saul. It's disappointing that.
Yeah.
Sorry for the spoiler alert. Anyways, in LA, did you see what they just announced this week? That they
That they don't have power? That they're out of money?
There is that. Well,
that they're gay?
Well,
no. Okay.
all those things, but they've already known that. That's not new.
This is
But
new information.
they're not any longer going to prosecute petty crimes under the amount of $950.
I did see that.
So you'll get a ticket, but they're going to dismiss the uncollected citations.
Man, unbelief is so stupid.
Yeah, and so when I saw that, I was like, okay, so if I get caught carrying my firearm in LA, I'm probably going to get charged with the felony, right?
I'm not sure what the law is, but it's pretty.
I mean, it's California,
Yeah,
so you have to have your firearm and your ammo, or you're locked up in separate locations, which is completely pointless.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
So
when it attacks you, you're like, hang on.
Yeah. Hold on, let me. Oh, I dropped my keys. So that's most likely what would happen. But if my firearm got stolen, right?
Yeah.
It's less than $950, so the police would just be like, meh.
Me.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's just crazy.
So we were talking with Dr. Lisle about how the biblical worldview gives a grounding. It provides the preconditions necessary for the scientific method, for sense perception to be meaningful, for laws of logic, laws of arithmetic, those sorts of things. But this comes down to another thing the Christian worldview provides a grounding for, and that is ultimate ethics.
Exactly.
So the law of God's. It's interesting because this discussion actually does, and you know this, it rubs against the common Christian culture,
Yeah.
right? And this gets to the law of God discussion. Evangelicalism in the West today has a very different perspective than biblical Christianity or historic Christianity. So when you think about even the Puritans, the Christians who came over to this continent
Right.
and started establishing communities, when they started establishing communities, those communities were not just willy-nilly saying, hey, how should we deal with theft?
Right.
Maybe a ticket and sort of just let it go.
Yeah.
They were saying, well, how do you deal with theft? They didn't have a question about, like, where do you go for the answer?
Right.
When they were even writing up their laws and statutes, they pointed to the law of God. They directly quoted from Deuteronomy, Leviticus, those sorts of things. So, for example, in the early colonies, it was still against the law to have sex with animals. And that was for a
Like
reason.
in the state law.
Yeah, it was against the law to have
Yeah.
sex with animals. It
Yeah.
was considered an abomination.
Yeah.
And death penalty.
Yeah. Wow.
If people would engage in that sort of a thing. If you murdered somebody in the early colonies, because they pointed to God's law, they actually upheld human value and dignity. And they said, for example, like in God's law, it's interesting in Exodus, as we get the Ten Commandments and it says, thou shalt not kill, the word ratzak, the semantic domain of the word ratzak is murder.
Murder.
Because thou shalt not kill, but then it turns around a few verses later and it says, and if somebody does kill somebody, you kill them back.
Yeah.
That's my way of summarizing. Kill them back.
That's your Hebrew.
Yeah, it's a Hebrew transliteration. Kill them back. So there's the biblical worldview that says, look, the human life is so valuable and has so much purpose. There's so much beautiful dignity in a human being that if somebody goes so far as to actually kill, to murder somebody, then they deserve, through the state, execution. So anyways, early on in the colonies, because of the Christian worldview, they actually pointed to God's law and biblical standards. But we've gotten away from that. I think a lot of it has to do with eschatology.
Yes.
I hate to keep talking about that, but it is
a reality.
It is a reality. And a lot of it has to do with very perverse ways that we have twisted the biblical worldview in terms of the application of God's law under the new covenant. People think today, because we're saved by grace through faith, people say so the law is irrelevant. But that wasn't Paul's perspective.
No.
As a matter of fact, in the premier text where Paul talks about the gospel in a systematic way, in Romans 3, in the same breath while he's saying that it's all a gift of God's grace, it's all for the propitiation of Jesus, and it's apart from law to any degree, the law can't be used to justify anybody, he then says, do we then make void the law through faith? So in the same discussion about faith alone, he says, so then do we void it? Which law is he talking about? The known law, the law that can't justify you.
Right.
He says, no, we actually uphold it because now we're Christians, we're saved. So because we have a perverse view of the law of God in evangelicalism today, we say it's irrelevant. We have California saying, well, petty theft, a ticket, maybe a ticket, like there's no justice.
Right.
So it's a different perspective than, say, God has in Deuteronomy chapter 4. When he gives the law to his people, he has a different perspective about the law. He actually says that the law that he's giving was supposed to be their wisdom in the sight of the peoples. That all the people were supposed to look into God's law, and from the surrounding pagan nations, they were supposed to look at that law and say, gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Look at these statutes. Look how just this is. Like, look, if somebody steals, God over here in Israel, he says they have to pay it back.
Yeah.
And then pay it back.
You get to keep your hand.
Yeah, exactly. You get to. You're not going to chop my arm off for stealing like a thing of bread. Like, that's justice. And look, hey, over here he has even a different statute, case law example, where if you steal something that has to do with somebody's business and production, it's a different repayment because you've taken away somebody's business. And so they would say, my goodness, this is justice. Or in God's law, here's a great example, Pastor Luke. If in God's law, if you rape somebody, this is big. We say today, because we don't want God's law, we say, oh look, this guy raped somebody. What do we do about it? It's interesting. My girlfriend in high school, she was raped, and she was raped in her bathroom floor on her birthday. I know, very tragic situation. It's horrible to even describe, but I think it's important for us to talk about things like this because it's reality. It's the world we live in. Sinful world. These things happen. How do you punish it? Well, she was raped on her birthday by a stranger who came to the party. She didn't know him, but when she walked back in the back of the house, he grabs her, brings her to the bathroom, and does this horrible, horrible thing. Well, they caught him, thankfully, and his punishment was 6 months in jail. 6 months in jail.
Yeah.
That's how the state of California, San Diego, by the way, that's where it was. San Diego in California punished a man who raped a girl on her bathroom floor on her birthday.
It was probably during a rolling blackout. That's why no one noticed.
I mean, seriously, what do you do with something like that? Someone says, what statutes should we apply to this? Well, because we don't want God's statutes, we don't value a girl, because she was only 14 years old or 15 years old when this happened. We don't value a young girl like that enough to say that what happened was horrific. So we say, was your first offense? Okay, 6 months should do it. But it's like, what did you take away from her? And what did you destroy in her life? And how valuable is she and her body? So we say no to God's law. So 6 month in California penalty for rape. And then you get into situations where somebody has their property stolen. And we say, well, you just give them a ticket for it. And it's like, well, wait, what about the victim?
Right.
So God's concerned in his law for the victim. And so for the premier person to go to say, well, how should we view this? How do we view life in God's law and the application of God's law is Jesus. Jesus says in Matthew 5, this most famous sermon in history, the most famous sermon in history, his most famous sermon, he says in Matthew 5, 17 through 19, do not even begin to think.
Yeah.
Me nomasete in the Greek is what it says. He's not saying stop thinking. He says don't even start thinking.
Right.
That I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And so he actually says the person who is greatest in the kingdom of God is the one who does the law and teaches it. Which law is he talking about?
Exactly.
The known law.
Right.
But Jesus, when he's asked, what's the greatest commandment in the law, he actually quotes from Leviticus. That's the law book, right? With all the statutes about sex with animals and theft and murder and rape and all the rest. Well, Jesus says, here's the first from Deuteronomy 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And then he says, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. What's interesting is people say, well, like, that's it for the Christian now. I say to that, thank you. You just gave me all the law and the prophets.
Yeah, right.
Because all the law and the prophets are built upon love for God and love for neighbor. So even the statutes of justice, in terms of penalties, that is love for neighbor and love for God.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I let a criminal get away with theft as a civil magistrate, when I let him get away with theft, what I'm doing is I'm actually not loving the victim, because now I haven't allowed for the victim to be made whole.
Yeah.
So I'm not loving the victim, and I'm letting the person who committed the crime to really get away. When I don't punish rape properly in culture and society, I am hating my neighbor. Because God says, love God, love neighbor, and all the law and the prophets, Jesus says, are built upon that. So what it means is when God says, here's how you deal with theft in culture and society, this is the standard of justice. What it means is that's how you love your neighbor. And if you don't follow God's revelation of a proper statute, then you're not loving your neighbor, because the law and the prophets are built upon it, which means punishing rapists with the death penalty when there's proper evidence and witnesses and all the rest, and God has God says rules for that. 2 to 3 independent lines of witness and testimony have to be in place to actually bring that charge against somebody. What it means is the penalty of death for the rapist is the proper way to love your neighbor. The penalty for repayment of theft is the proper way to love your neighbor. The penalty of death for murder is the way to love your neighbor. And so that's how you love your neighbor. And then, so what we always say is we describe it like this: love God and love neighbor. Jesus says that's it. And everything's built upon that. So you do the 10 Commandments and you work from there. Love God. Have no other God before me. Don't have a God that looks like me. Don't take my name in vain. That's how you love God. Second table. How do you love your neighbor? Don't lie to them. Don't steal from them. Don't covet their stuff. Don't murder them. And don't commit adultery. How do you love your neighbor? How do you love your neighbor?
Right.
And then further, when you get to the statutes of penalties, God is saying, and then here's how you love me and love your neighbor with the penalties. Proper way to order society. So, we were just talking with Dr. Lisle about the biblical worldview, and God's word is the foundation for sense perception, logic, science, and all the rest. But I would actually argue, we would argue, that actually the biblical worldview is the foundation and grounding for proper justice and righteousness in society.
Yeah. And I was going to say, even when it comes to rape, the way we handle it in our society, ultimately the only person the state is truly loving, and it's not a just love, is the rapist.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're not given what they deserve, and then they turn around and then they steal. The state steals because they make us pay for the rapist's time in the cage for however long it is, right?
Yeah.
And then if there is an offspring produced from the rape, then they allow murder. You know, it just continues further and further.
Kill the victim.
Exactly, the wrong direction, right?
Yeah, so we will advocate for execution as the
exactly.
result of rape, but only executing the child,
Exactly.
right? Not
Yeah.
the father who actually committed the crime.
Yeah.
So we're not against executions for rape.
Right.
It just has to be the innocent
Right.
victim.
Exactly. So when God's standards
It's
not upheld,
perverse.
yeah, there's actually more crime committed
Right.
than if they would have handled the one appropriately.
Yeah, God's law is well, man's law today is concerned with rehabilitation. But that's not the role of the state.
No.
The state is not the church.
Nope.
The
avenger
state is not the
wrongdoing,
place
evildoing.
that's supposed to bring healing in the criminal.
Yeah.
The state is the place that's supposed to bring justice.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, it's interesting. This is actually powerful. Did we ever? I think we've talked about this. Because Christians have a hard time with categories with this in terms of the death penalty.
I was
They have
thinking
a
the same
hard
thing.
time with categories.
Yeah.
So Christians say, "Well, I want salvation for everybody," and we
Exactly.
ought to want that. We ought to.
Yeah.
The church is the place for mercy in terms of extending that mercy of the cross out to the world, saying,
Yeah.
look to Jesus for salvation. I want murderers and rapists and thieves and adulterers to be saved. And guess what? That's me,
Yeah.
right? But it's interesting because in God's law, from the mouth of God, he says to his people in terms of the death penalty, he says, if somebody kills somebody, this is the penalty, it's death. He says, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That means equal justice. He doesn't mean like gouge out a person's eye. He means just weights and scales, balances. But he tells his people when he says death penalty for murder, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, he says this, your eye shall not pity them. And I believe that because we don't obey God in the area of what is righteous justice in an area of penalty, because we allow for pity, right, in the courts,
Right.
now you've got people in the courts that are supposed to be the distributors of justice to make the victim whole, to love them, who are pitying,
Yeah.
saying, oh, I feel
Yeah.
so bad. We need to work on rehabilitating him.
Yeah.
And it's like, but your job is not to pity. Your job is to bring justice, to love your neighbor. That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
It's the church's job to come in and extend the mercy
Exactly.
and the forgiveness and say, point to Jesus. But the state's role is not to pity.
Yeah.
The state's role is to say, what did you do? Here's the proof. You're really guilty. You need to pay them back.
Yeah.
Or if the crime is very serious, it's death penalty and all the
Exactly.
rest. So the state is not supposed to be concerned with rehabilitation. That's the church's role. The state is supposed to be concerned with extending justice, and it's supposed to be concerned with the victim and not the criminal.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be to see the criminal as you're guilty, therefore this is what you owe.
Yeah.
Here's what you ought to do to make them whole again. And so the state is supposed to be so concerned with the victim that we say, I need to love the victim ultimately here. So what do you owe them?
Yeah.
Now the state of California is perverse because
In a lot of ways.
It says no to God's law,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't know what gender is.
Yeah.
It doesn't know what proper whole sexuality is. And then it starts stretching out across the board and saying, well, I see this person who's lowly and hurting right here, so let me steal from this person over here, take their stuff to pay for their stuff. So I'm going to actually have a moral failing in your life by stealing from you to take care of them. So they don't understand personal property,
Yeah.
all those things, and they make victims out of all of society because they pity one person's plight. And in the area of justice, they say, well, we're not going to be so concerned with you having your stuff stolen anymore. We're going to be more concerned with leniency. So because we've abandoned God's law and culture and society, we don't have a grounding for science. We don't have a grounding for morality and justice. We're in this world of just total chaos. And the good news of the gospel of the kingdom is that Jesus is ruling and reigning on his throne. Isaiah 2 Isaiah 42. We can keep going. Promise that as the kingdom of God expands across the earth and the nations come up to God's mountain, Isaiah 2 says, the law of God, the Torah, goes forth
Right.
from the people of God, which ultimately establishes, Isaiah 42, the justice that the coastlands are waiting for.
Yep.
Right? Isaiah 42 has the promise of Messiah's kingdom, and it says that he's going to do what? He's going to establish justice in the earth. So it's not just salvation,
Exactly.
souls being saved. God is concerned with establishing justice in
Right.
the earth.
Right.
One of the things I think we need to get our minds around as 21st century evangelicals is that God doesn't change. He's the God of mercy and justice in the Old Testament, and he's the God of mercy and justice in the New. The glory of the New Testament is that mercy is settled
Yeah.
at the cross. It's a once-for-all sacrifice. But what Christ is concerned with in the world as the ruling and reigning King of Kings is to bring about that salvation and justice and light and salt. And he does it through his church,
Yeah.
which brings us, I think, maybe as a final word to one of the aspects we've tried to extend that out of Apologia Church is in the area of justice for the preborn.
Exactly.
And we have a film up right now. It's on YouTube and Facebook, and hopefully by the time this goes up on Amazon Prime
Yeah. Hopefully.
as well. That's what we're working on. At least if it's not there yet, that's what we're working on. It's called Babies Are Still Murdered Here.
Yep.
And it's about an hour and 40-minute long documentary. It'll take you through from soup to nuts. Here's what's wrong. Here's the answer. Here's all the glorious things that God has done. I encourage you guys all to watch that. EndAbortionNow.com is also where you can go to watch it. Go to the website. You can go there to get signed up, to get trained, to get free resources. We don't want anything from your church. We just want to help.
Exactly.
And right now we have close to 450 churches local churches, who are out saving lives. Just this week before we filmed this, we got word from just one church that they saved 5
Right.
children
Yep.
in one
day.
morning.
Yeah.
That's one church
Yeah.
that saved 5 children.
It's amazing.
It is amazing.
Praise God.
That is awesome. All right, so we're good?
Yeah.
All right,
That's
guys.
awesome.
So go to endabortionnow.com to get more. Go get their training, get the resources, and go to apologiastudios.com to get all the podcasts, radio episodes, all the free training. Get all the TV shows, the after shows, Apologia Academy, everything right there. Thank you guys for watching Next Week with Jeff Durbin. We'll catch you guys next week. Thank you, guys.